I checked my GPS unit again. Minus 27 degrees Celsius at 2:15 in the afternoon, and the wind chill pushed it lower. The batteries wouldn't last much longer in this cold. How much farther? Sarah asked, her voice muffled by the thermal mask covering most of her face. Her breath formed a cloud that the wind immediately shredded. Alexander stopped 20 yards ahead of us, raised his gloved hand, then pointed down into the valley. The snow had lightened enough for visibility to extend beyond 50 yards. He said nothing, just kept his arm extended toward whatever he'd spotted. I trudged forward, each step breaking through the crust of snow. My thighs burned from 3 days of this. When I reached Alexander's position on the ridgeline, I followed his gesture and saw them. Dark geometric shapes interrupting the white landscape. Perfectly circular foundations, partially obscured by drifting snow, arranged in a pattern too deliberate to be natural. "Is that it?" I asked, unclipping my binoculars from inside my jacket. Alexander nodded once. "This is as far as I go." His English was precise but heavily accented. "I make camp here." He swung his pack down and began stomping a flat area in the snow. The cold made the binocular eyepieces stick to my skin when I pressed them to my face. I adjusted the focus. The structures stood in concentric rings, their stone walls intact despite what must have been centuries of Siberian winters. Some still had what appeared to be hide coverings stretched over doorways, not rotted, not collapsed. "Sarah," I called over my shoulder, "take a look at this." She came forward with Robert and James trailing behind. The graduate student's face was flushed from exertion, but James looked comfortable despite the camera equipment he carried. 3 years documenting expeditions in extreme environments had hardened him. Sarah took the binoculars and studied the valley. "That's impossible," she said, handing them to Robert. "Those coverings shouldn't be intact, not after even a decade in these conditions." I noted the time in my waterproof journal, then sketched a quick outline of the settlement's arrangement. "We need to get down there before we lose the light." Alexander spoke without looking up from where he hammered tent stakes into the frozen ground. "Bad place, bad spirits. Old people say no one comes back from that village." James perked up at this, adjusting his camera. "What do they say happened there?" Alexander shook his head. "Stories say the moon took them." "The moon," Robert repeated with the polite skepticism of a scientist addressing folklore. "You not camp there after dark," Alexander said. He glanced upward at the pale afternoon sky, then returned to securing his tent. I'd hired Alexander for his knowledge of the terrain, not his superstitions. The event guide had come recommended by the university's anthropology department for his familiarity with this remote region, but I hadn't anticipated this reluctance. "We'll be fine," I said, adjusting my pack straps. "We're paying you to wait here if that's your choice. Radio if there's trouble." The descent into the valley took 47 minutes. The snow deepened in the drifts, sometimes reaching mid-thigh. I established a switchback pattern to ease our progress down the steepest sections. My pack chafed against my shoulders despite the padding. "Dave," Sarah called from behind me, "look at the soil where the snow's blown clear." I stopped and examined the exposed ground near an outcropping. Dark and rich, not the thin, frozen soil typical of the region. I scooped some into a sample bag, labeled it with the time and GPS coordinates. "Robert, when we reach the perimeter, I want core samples every 10 meters. He nodded, adjusting his pack where the auger handles protruded. We reached the first structure as the light began to fade. Up close, the preservation was even more remarkable. The circular stone foundation rose 3 feet from the ground, each block fitted so precisely that I couldn't slide my knife blade between them. No mortar. No sign of erosion or frost heave had disturbed the placement. James circled the structure, filming methodically. "This doesn't make sense," he said, focusing on where a hide covering, what looked like reindeer skin, hung over the entrance. "This should be rotted away to nothing." I ran my gloved hand over the hide. It felt supple, the hair still attached, preserved somehow despite exposure to elements that should have destroyed it decades ago. I noted this in my journal, sketched the doorway dimensions, then photographed the structure from each cardinal direction. Sarah worked on establishing a baseline grid for mapping the site, pounding marking stakes at measured intervals. Robert collected his first soil core, carefully extruding a column of dark earth into a collection tube. As the light dimmed further, I looked up and registered the full layout of the settlement. 7 concentric circles of huts, each perfectly spaced, all centered around a massive stone pillar that rose at least 20 feet from the valley floor. The monolith stood darker than the surrounding stone, its surface covered in markings I couldn't distinguish from this distance. "We need to set up before dark," I said, checking my watch. 3:45 and the light was already failing. "James, help Robert secure the equipment tent. Sarah, let's get the sleeping tents oriented with the entrances away from the wind." We worked in practiced coordination, having done this routine dozens of times on previous expeditions. The portable heater came online with a soft hum. The 4-season tents went up, tied off to dead man anchors buried in the snow. I established our camp at what appeared to be the outermost ring of the settlement, deliberately keeping some distance from the structures themselves. Professional courtesy to the site, though there was clearly no one left to mind our presence. As full darkness settled over the valley, I powered up the satellite phone and checked for a signal. 2 bars, enough to send our position update to the university. The message sent, confirming our arrival at the target coordinates. From my tent entrance, I watched the last light fade from the sky. The waning crescent moon appeared from behind clouds, casting faint silver light across the settlement. The monolith at the center caught the moonlight differently than the surrounding stones, seeming to absorb rather than reflect it. Up on the ridge, Alexander's fire burned bright against the darkness. I could make out his silhouette moving between the flame and his tent. He kept looking toward us, then up at the moon. "What do you make of those coverings?" Sarah asked, crouching next to me with a steaming cup of reconstituted soup. "Even with extreme cold preservation, they shouldn't be in that condition." "Could be replacements," I suggested. "Maybe trappers or other nomadic groups use this place occasionally." She shook her head. "There's no evidence of modern materials or techniques, and Alexander clearly knew about this place, but he wasn't surprised by what we found, just afraid of it." I logged her observation in my journal. The valley was quieter than it should have been, no wind whistling between the structures, no small animal sounds in the darkness. "We'll do a proper survey tomorrow," I said, sipping my own soup. The hot liquid did little to dispel the chill that I woke at first light, the fabric of my sleeping bag crackling with frost as I reached for my thermometer. -22 degrees Celsius, warmer than yesterday. The portable heater had shut off sometime during the night, fuel conservation protocol. I pulled on my base layers, thermal mid-layers, and outer shell in practiced sequence, each movement precise to minimize exposure to the cold. Outside, the valley lay perfectly still. No wind, no sound, just crystalline air that burned my lungs with each breath. A pale band of light stretched across the eastern ridge, silhouetting Alexander's distant camp. Through my binoculars, I could see him already moving around his fire, his gaze fixed on our position. "Weather's holding," I said when Sarah emerged from her tent, her breath forming dense clouds in the still air. She nodded, zipping her jacket to her chin. "I've got the mapping kit ready. Robert set up the survey station last night." We ate freeze-dried eggs and instant coffee in silence. James checked his camera equipment while Robert organized soil collection tubes in his pack. I reviewed our site assessment protocol, marking the priority areas on my field map. By the time the sun cleared the ridge, we were ready to move. "Alexander's not coming down," Robert said, squinting up at the ridge where our guide remained by his fire. "We don't need him for this part," I replied. "Let's work the outer ring first, then move inward systematically. James, I want comprehensive footage of each structure before we disturb anything." The first hut stood 15 feet from our camp. Up close, the stonework showed craftsmanship I hadn't fully appreciated yesterday. Each block had been cut to interlock with its neighbors, creating walls that hadn't shifted despite centuries of freeze-thaw cycles that should have heaved them apart. I ran my hand along the interior wall. The stone felt oddly warm against my gloved fingers, warmer than ambient temperature would explain. I pulled off my glove and touched the surface directly. Definitely warmer. I made a note of this anomaly, recording the time and location. "Dave," Sarah called from the doorway. "The hide covering, it's not just preserved. Look at the attachment points." I examined where the reindeer skin fastened to the stone. No evidence of tanning chemicals, no modern fasteners. Just sinew thread through precisely drilled holes. The craftsmanship suggested techniques consistent with prehistoric nomadic cultures, but the materials showed virtually no degradation. "Robert, I need samples from this covering. Minute fragments only, labeled by location." He nodded, retrieving his collection kit. The soil cores from yesterday show unusual organic content, higher nitrogen levels than should be possible in this climate. We documented 6 huts in the outermost ring before noon. Each displayed the same impossible preservation, the same precise stonework. No metal tools, no modern materials, just structures that looked as if their inhabitants might return at any moment. The second ring contained 12 huts, arranged at equal distances from each other. Their construction matched the outer ring, but these had carved symbols beside their doorways, simple geometric patterns that Sarah photographed from multiple angles. "These could be family markings," she suggested, "or indicators of function. They're consistent with Tungusic patterns, but not identical to any documented examples." I nodded, sketching the symbols in my journal. "Let's get to the center. We can work our way back out systematically afterward." We crossed through 3 more rings of huts, each displaying increasingly elaborate doorway carvings. Robert collected soil samples at measured intervals, while James filmed everything in silent concentration. The village felt empty yet undisturbed, as if time had simply stopped here rather than passed. The monolith stood at the exact center, rising 20 feet from a circular stone platform. Even from 50 yards away, I could see the density of carvings covering its surface. My pace quickened involuntarily. "This can't be right," I muttered as we approached. The monolith was perfectly proportioned, its surface covered in carvings so intricate and precise they resembled fine-line engravings rather than stonework. Human figures wrapped around the pillar in a continuous narrative band, spiraling upward toward a prominent crescent moon symbol at the top. "Have you ever seen anything like this?" Robert asked, his voice hushed despite the empty landscape. I shook my head. "Not in 15 years of fieldwork. This craftsmanship would require metal tools, but the style is inconsistent with any culture that had metallurgy. The carvings depicted human figures engaged in what appeared to be daily activities, hunting, cooking, building, in the bottom sections. Moving upward, the scenes gradually shifted. The humans began facing a central figure wearing a crescent headdress, then offering items, food, tools, what looked like animal skins. "They're showing progressive stages of worship," Sarah said, photographing each section methodically. "See how the offerings become more elaborate as you move upward?" I traced my fingers over a carved figure carrying what appeared to be a small animal toward the crescent symbol. The stone felt warm, just like the hut walls. The carving's face showed an unsettling mix of reverence and fear, rendered with such skill that the expression seemed to shift slightly as clouds passed overhead, changing the angle of light. "The dating doesn't make sense," I said, taking measurements of the monolith's diameter. "The preservation, the craftsmanship, none of it aligns with the apparent age of the site." Sarah moved to the opposite side, then stopped abruptly. "Dave, these faces..." She adjusted her camera, not completing the thought. I circled to her position. This section showed figures kneeling before the crescent, arms raised in supplication. Their faces bore expressions of terror rendered in impossible detail for stone carving. The eyes seemed almost concave, carved deeper than the surrounding features. "What tools could make these?" Robert asked, magnifying glass in hand. Even with modern equipment, this level of detail would be challenging. I documented each section, working methodically despite a growing sense of wrongness I couldn't articulate. The narrative clearly told a story of developing worship, but the emotional progression in the carved faces suggested something beyond mere religious devotion. By mid-afternoon, we had photographed, measured, and documented the entire monolith. James had filmed everything but remained unusually quiet, concentrating on his work. "The soil here is different," Robert said, extracting a core sample from the base of the platform. "Almost black. And look." He held up the clear collection tube. "It's warm enough to create condensation inside the tube." I checked my watch. "We have 3 more hours of good light. Sarah, continue mapping the 4th and 5th rings. Robert, I want comparative samples from each ring and the spaces between structures. James, get footage of the village layout from the highest vantage point you can safely reach." They dispersed to their tasks while I remained at the monolith, sketching details of the carvings. The precision troubled me most. No tool marks, no corrections, no evidence of the carving process itself. Just perfect, fluid lines cutting through stone that should have resisted such treatment. I worked my way around the pillar again, following the narrative. The figures in the highest sections had changed their posture, no longer presenting offerings, but prostrating themselves completely before the crescent symbol. Their carved faces showed a mixture of ecstasy and agony that made me uncomfortable to study directly. The late afternoon light cast long shadows across the site, making the carved figures seem to move in my peripheral vision. I checked my watch. 4:15. The sun would set in less than an hour. "Let's wrap up," I called to the others. "Pack the day's samples and secure the equipment before dark." Sarah approached, her notebook clutched tightly. "The mapping's complete for the outer 5 rings. We'll finish the inner 2 tomorrow." She glanced at the monolith, then quickly away. "The proportions are perfect. Every structure is exactly equidistant from the center." "Any evidence of habitation? Tools, refuse, fire pits?" She shook her head. "Nothing. It's like they built it and abandoned it immediately. Or what? Or something removed all traces of daily life." She rubbed her gloved hands together. "Did you notice the carvings seem to watch you? The way the eyes are cut, they catch the light from any angle." I had noticed, but hesitated to validate what sounded like superstition. "It's a common technique in relief carving. Creates an illusion of movement depending on viewing angle." We gathered our equipment and returned to camp as the light faded. Robert organized the day's samples, while James transferred his footage to backup drives. I recorded the day's findings in my journal, sketching the most significant carvings from memory. The sequence troubled me. The narrative progression showed a community becoming increasingly focused on the crescent symbol, their offerings growing more elaborate, their postures more submissive. The final carvings, at the very top, where they were difficult to see clearly, appeared to show the humans prone on the ground, the crescent symbol above them larger than in previous scenes. Alexander's fire burned bright on the ridge again. Through my binoculars, I could see him pacing, occasionally stopping to look down at our camp, then up at the sky where the waning crescent moon had appeared. "I'm having trouble with the equipment," James said, breaking the silence. He frowned at his laptop screen. "Some of the footage from the monolith is corrupted, just static in sections." "Memory card issue?" I suggested, making a note of the technical problem. "Maybe." He didn't sound convinced. "It only happens with shots of certain carvings." Sarah handed me a mug of reconstituted soup. The outer huts have mundane symbols, hunting, shelter, family groupings, but the inner rings show the crescent repeatedly, increasingly dominant in each successive ring. I nodded, sipping the bland liquid. Classic pattern of spatial reinforcement. Sacred centers with decreasing religious significance as you move outward. Except nothing about this site follows classic patterns, she countered. No culture I know of achieves this level of stonework without leaving tool marks or evidence of construction methods. The temperature dropped rapidly as full darkness settled. We retreated to our tents after securing the samples and equipment. From my sleeping bag, I reviewed the day's notes, comparing the monolith carvings to known examples of prehistoric art. Nothing matched. The technical execution suggested modern methods, but the context and materials contradicted this entirely. I switched off my headlamp and lay in darkness, listening to the absolute silence of the valley. No wind, no animals, not even the creaking of ice, just complete stillness broken only by the occasional shifting of my teammates in their tents. When I closed my eyes, I saw the carved faces from the monolith, their expressions of worship and terror etched against my eyelids. I tried to rationalize the sight, perhaps a modern reconstruction, perhaps an unknown civilization with advanced techniques, perhaps a geological anomaly that preserved structures far beyond their expected lifespan. None of these explanations satisfied me. Something fundamental about this place defied archaeological categorization. I'd need more data, more samples, more time to understand what we'd found. Above our camp, the crescent, I woke before the others, my watch showing 5:27 in the morning. The temperature inside my tent hovered at -18 degrees Celsius, warmer than yesterday. I pulled on my thermal layers and boots, then unzipped the tent slowly to minimize the fabrics crackling in the cold. The village lay silent beneath a sky turning pale blue at the eastern horizon. The monolith cast a long shadow across the concentric rings of huts. I made a circuit of our camp, checking equipment and sample containers while logging the morning temperature and cloud conditions in my field journal. Something caught my eye beyond the northernmost huts, a darkness against the snow that didn't match the regular shadows of the structures. I walked toward it, following a path between two perfectly preserved dwellings. 20 yards past the final hut, the ground sloped upward where the valley met the mountain's base. There, partially obscured by a snowdrift and sheltered by an overhanging rock formation, a black opening cut into the mountainside. I approached cautiously, measuring my steps. The entrance stood roughly 5 feet high and 3 feet wide, large enough to enter without crawling, but small enough to have escaped our notice during yesterday's survey. Fresh snow had drifted against one side, but the opening itself remained clear, as if protected from the weather by the rock formation above. When I returned to camp, Sarah was heating water on our portable stove. "Found something," I said, accepting the metal cup she offered. "Cave entrance beyond the northern perimeter. Not visible from our initial survey position." She frowned. "We should document it today. The university will want a comprehensive site assessment." "I'm going to explore it after breakfast. The carvings might continue inside." "We shouldn't split up," Sarah said. "This place feels..." She stopped herself. "Feels what?" She shook her head. "Just professional caution. Archaeological best practices." Robert emerged from his tent, followed shortly by James. We ate freeze-dried breakfast while I sketched the cave's position relative to the settlement. "The entrance is sheltered but accessible," I explained. "Could be natural, could be modified. Either way, it warrants investigation." "I'll go with you," Robert offered, his earlier hesitation apparently forgotten in the light of day. James nodded, patting his camera. "I'll document everything. This could explain the site's unusual preservation." Sarah pressed her lips together but didn't argue further. "I'll continue mapping the inner rings and collecting surface samples. Just maintain radio contact." We finished breakfast and prepared our equipment. I packed extra batteries for our headlamps, a measuring tape, sample bags, and my journal. Robert brought his camera and collection tools, while James checked his video equipment. 2 hours, I told Sarah. "If we're not back or haven't radioed, come to the entrance, but don't enter alone." She nodded, already laying out her mapping tools. The cave mouth felt colder than the surrounding air as we approached. A gentle current of air flowed outward, carrying a faint mineral smell and something else I couldn't identify. Not decay, but something organic and unfamiliar. "Temperature drop," Robert said, holding up his handheld thermometer. "-23 inside the entrance. 5 degrees colder than ambient." I clicked on my headlamp and ducked inside. The walls were smooth stone, narrowing slightly before widening into a chamber roughly 8 feet across. I swept my light across the surfaces and stopped. Carvings covered every inch, their style matching those on the monolith, but with significantly more detail. "Same craftsmanship," I said, examining the nearest section. "No tool marks, no erosion." James moved past me, his camera light illuminating deeper sections of wall. "These are different from the surface carvings." He was right. Where the monolith had shown worship and offering, these depicted something else entirely. Human figures lay prone beneath larger, hunched shapes. The crescent symbol dominated the uppermost sections, larger and more elaborate than its surface counterpart. "They're showing predation," Robert said quietly. His light focused on a sequence where the hunched figures appeared to be tearing apart the humans beneath them. "Look at the positioning." I photographed each section methodically, measuring the chamber dimensions and noting the position of major carved elements. The passage continued deeper into the mountain, sloping downward at a 15-degree angle. "We should see how far it goes," I said, already moving toward the descending path. The tunnel narrowed for approximately 12 feet before opening into a second chamber, smaller than the first but with a higher ceiling. Our headlamps created overlapping pools of light that caught the gleam of something white against the far wall. "What's that?" James asked, swinging his camera toward it. I approached cautiously, my light revealing a pale form partially embedded in the chamber floor. Robert stumbled over something and fell hard, his headlamp beam swinging wildly across the ceiling. "You all right?" I asked, turning. "Yeah, just..." He pointed to what had tripped him. A long bone lay partially exposed in the soil, human femur, adult size. I turned back to the white form against the wall. Not a rock formation as I'd initially thought, but a human skeleton, its bones bleached with age. The remains still wore fragments of fur clothing, rotted to barely recognizable scraps that clung to the rib cage and arm bones. "No skull," I noted, kneeling beside it. The cervical vertebrae ended abruptly, the edges smooth and precise. Clean breaks on the C1 and C2 vertebrae, not consistent with animal predation or weathering. I photographed the skeleton from multiple angles, measuring its position relative to the chamber walls and the tunnel entrance. The bones showed no signs of gnawing or scavenging, just the deliberate absence of the skull. "My camera's dead," James said suddenly, the red recording light on his device extinguished. "You charged it last night," I said. "I saw the indicator." "I know." He slapped the side of the camera. Battery was at 93% when we entered. Robert had recovered from his fall and was examining the femur he'd tripped over. "This doesn't belong to the skeleton against the wall. Different individual." I shined my light around the chamber floor more carefully. Scattered bones lay partially buried in the soil. At least 2 more individuals, their remains disarticulated, but showing the same pattern. Complete skeletons, minus their skulls. "We need to document this properly," I said, taking sample bags from my pack. "Soil from around each skeleton, fragments of the clothing if possible." James tried his camera again. Still dead. My backup battery too. "Use your phone," I suggested, taking photographs with my own camera. "No signal, of course, but the camera should..." He frowned at his screen. "Same problem. It powers on but dies as soon as I try to photograph the remains." I handed him my camera. "Try mine." He aimed it at the skeleton against the wall and pressed the shutter. The camera died instantly. "Some kind of electromagnetic interference?" Robert suggested, though he sounded uncertain. "I've never seen anything affect equipment like this," I said, pocketing my useless camera. "Let's make detailed notes and collect the samples. We can come back with different equipment." I sketched the chamber layout and the position of each set of remains while Robert collected soil samples from around the bones. James stood near the tunnel entrance, repeatedly trying his camera without success. "There's another passage," Robert said, pointing to a dark opening at the chamber's far side. "Goes deeper." I checked my watch. We'd been inside for 43 minutes. "We have time for a quick look, but we stay together." The new tunnel was narrower than the first, requiring us to hunch as we proceeded. After 15 feet, it opened into a third chamber, larger than either of the previous two. Our lights revealed more remains scattered across the floor. At least 4 more skeletons, all missing their skulls. Same clean separation at the vertebrae, I noted, examining the nearest remains. Same preservation state. These people died at approximately the same time. "Look at the walls," Robert said, his voice tight. I raised my light. The carvings here were larger, more elaborate. They showed the crescent symbol dominating the entire upper section, with human figures arranged in concentric circles below it. Above the humans, the hunched shapes I'd noticed earlier were more clearly defined. Massive figures with elongated limbs and what appeared to be fur or hair covering their bodies. "Those carvings match the village layout," Robert said. 7 rings of structures centered on the monolith. He was right. The carved design precisely mirrored the surface settlement. "And these," I said, indicating the hunched figures, "correspond to the number of dwellings in each ring." A sudden sound from deeper in the cave made us freeze. A soft scraping, like something dragging across stone, followed by silence. "Probably ice movement," I said, after several seconds had passed without further noise. "Or rock settling." "We should go back," James said, backing toward the tunnel. "Sarah will be wondering where we are." I checked my watch again. We'd been gone for 58 minutes. "Agreed. We've found enough to justify a full excavation team." We retreated through the narrow passage to the second chamber, then back to the first. I paused at the entrance, letting my eyes adjust to the daylight. Something seemed different about the carvings near the cave mouth, a detail I hadn't noticed on our way in. "Wait," I said, studying the wall. "These figures are facing inward, toward the deeper chambers. All the others face the crescent symbol. Maybe they're showing people entering the cave?" Robert suggested. I shook my head. "Their posture is different. See how they're hunched? More like the predator figures than the humans." Before Robert could respond, Sarah appeared at the cave entrance, breathing hard. "You need to see this," she said, her voice controlled but tense. "I found something by the monolith." We followed her back through the village to the central stone pillar. On its northern side, partially obscured by drifted snow, lay a human form. Not a skeleton like those in the cave, but a body in an advanced state of preservation. The cold had mummified the remains, leaving dried skin stretched over bone. The clothing, a heavy wool coat with fur trim, leather boots, canvas pants, suggested someone from the mid-20th century. Russian-made by the look of the stitching. "Male, approximately 30 to 40 years old," Sarah said, her clinical tone betraying her effort to remain professional. "Cause of death undetermined, but no head," I finished for her, noting the same clean separation at the neck vertebrae we'd observed in the cave remains. "I found identification in the coat pocket," she continued, holding up a plastic evidence bag containing a weathered leather wallet. "Soviet-era documents, dated 1962. "Where's the skull?" James asked, looking around as if it might be lying nearby. "None of them had skulls," I said. "Not this one, not the ones in the cave." 7 skeletons in the cave, Robert added. 7 rings of huts. I knelt beside the remains, examining the neck separation more closely. The break pattern is identical to the older remains. Same method, same tool. I avoided saying teeth, though the thought had formed unbidden. "This doesn't make sense," Sarah said, her composure slipping slightly. We have evidence of deaths spanning centuries, all with the same unusual pattern, all within this settlement. Alexander warned us, James said quietly. He said no one returns from this village. I stood, brushing snow from my knees. We document everything. Detailed notes, measurements, samples. No theories yet, just evidence. Dave, Sarah said, her voice dropping. Look at the monolith, the carvings above where I found the body. I followed her gaze upward. The late morning sun illuminated a section of carvings I hadn't examined closely before. They showed the hunched figures arranged around what appeared to be a human body, its neck separated from a perfectly carved circular object, unmistakably a severed head. It's a record, I said finally. Not worship, documentation. Of what? Robert asked. I didn't answer immediately, instead turning to look at the ridge where Alexander maintained his solitary camp. Through my binoculars, I could see him watching us, his stance rigid even at this distance. We need to ask him what he knows about this place, I said. Not the legends, the facts. I radioed Alexander, asking him to come down to discuss our findings. His response crackled through after a long pause. Not safe. You come up here. I considered arguing, but changed my mind. Robert, James, continue documenting the remains Sarah found. Photograph everything in situ before we decide whether to excavate. Sarah, come with me to speak with Alexander. As we walked toward the ridge, Sarah matched my pace. The carvings in the cave, she said. What did they show exactly? A progression, I replied. First worship and offering, then consumption. Like the monolith, but more explicit? I nodded. The same artistic style, but with greater detail. The sequence is clear once you see both sets together. And the bodies? 7 in the cave, all missing their heads, all with clean separation at the same vertebrae. Sarah walked in silence for several moments. Whatever happened here, it wasn't a one-time event. The Soviet-era body proves that. Yes, I agreed. And Alexander's warning suggests it's still happening. We climbed the steep path to the ridge where Alexander had established his camp. The wind bit harder at this elevation, cutting through my layers despite the bright sunlight. Alexander stood by his fire, watching our approach with undisguised wariness. You find bodies, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes, I answered. 7 in the cave, 1 by the monolith, more recent. He nodded once, unsurprised. All missing heads. What do you know about this place? I asked directly. Not stories. What have you seen? Alexander poked at his fire with a stick, his eyes never leaving my face. 3 years ago, scientific team like yours. 4 people. They camped 2 nights. I stay here like now. He pointed to the valley below. 3rd morning I go down. Find 2 people. No heads. Others gone. Gone where? Sarah asked. He shrugged. Never found. Same as village people. What happened to the original inhabitants? I pressed. Moon took them, he said simply. Like I told you. That's a legend, I said. I need facts. Alexander's expression hardened. You find 7 bodies in cave, 1 by stone, all missing heads. What more facts you need? I changed tactics. Have you been inside the cave? He shook his head. Never. Bad place. Did you tell the authorities about the deaths you witnessed? Yes. Filed report in Yakutsk. Officials come, take bodies, ask questions. Then say accident, animal attack. Close case. His tone made it clear what he thought of their conclusion. But you kept guiding people here? Sarah noted. Not here specifically. They hire me for region. I try to avoid this valley. But scientists, they have maps, coordinates. They insist. He pointed at me. Like you. I considered what he'd told us. We need to alert the university about the remains we've found. They'll want to send a forensic team. They not come in time, Alexander said cryptically. In time for what? He looked up at the sky, then back at me. Moon is wrong shape now. When it changes 3 days from now, you should be gone. I felt Sarah tense beside me, but I kept my expression neutral. We're staying until we've properly documented the site. Alexander shrugged again. Your choice, but I leave in 2 days, with or without you. We thanked him for the information and began our descent back to the village. Halfway down, Sarah stopped. Dave, what if he's right? What if there is something periodic about whatever happened here? If there is, it's entirely natural, I replied. Some environmental factor that drives predator behavior, perhaps. We'll take precautions, but we're not abandoning this discovery. She nodded, though her expression remained troubled. The lunar cycle affects animal behavior. It's documented science. Exactly. Nothing supernatural about it. When we reached the camp, Robert and James had finished documenting the remains by the monolith and were sorting through the day's samples. Alexander confirmed previous deaths here, I told them. He witnessed similar remains 3 years ago, but claims authorities dismissed it as animal attacks. No animal removes heads with surgical precision, Robert said. We need to establish a guard rotation tonight, I decided. 2-hour shifts. I'll take first watch. As the sun dipped toward the western ridge, I sat outside my tent with my journal, sketching the cave carvings from memory, while occasionally scanning our surroundings with my binoculars. The village remained silent and still. Above, the waning crescent moon appeared thin and sharp against the darkening sky. I added one final note before waking Sarah for her shift. Cave appears to document same phenomena as monolith carvings, but from inside perspective, rather than worship perspective. Remains show consistent patterns spanning centuries. Alexander's warning ties deaths to lunar cycle. Possible environmental trigger for predator activity? Need core samples from cave floor to establish timeline of remains. I closed my journal and zipped it into my waterproof case. Despite my rational explanations, I found myself listening intently to the silence, waiting for it to break. I logged the last soil sample at 6:43 in the evening as the temperature dropped to minus 19 degrees. We gathered in the common area between our tents, huddling around the portable heater, while James distributed rehydrated beef stew in metal cups. The sun had dipped below the western ridge, leaving the village in deep blue twilight. The samples from the cave show higher organic content than the surface soil, Robert said, blowing steam from his cup. Almost like composted material. Sarah nodded. The village architecture suggests permanence, but there's no evidence of subsistence activity. No middens, no butchering areas. They could have disposed of waste in the cave system, I suggested, making a note in my journal. Might explain the organic soil signature. We ate in silence for several minutes, the scratching of my pencil the only sound beyond our spoons against metal. The quiet broke with a low, vibrating rumble that seemed to emanate from the ground itself. I froze mid-bite. Did you feel that? The rumble came again, longer this time, a deep, resonant growl that traveled through the frozen earth into my boots. It lasted 8 seconds before fading. Geological activity, Robert offered, though his voice lacked conviction. No, Sarah said, setting down her cup. That was organic. I pressed my palm against the ground, feeling the vibration return. Stronger, sustained, and undulating in pitch. The sound registered somewhere between 20 and 40 hertz, below the normal range of human speech, but distinctly audible through bone conduction. Too regular for settlement, James said, pulling out his audio recorder. Too variable for ice movement. The growling intensified, now coming from multiple directions simultaneously. One source directly beneath our camp, another from the direction of the cave, a third from somewhere near the monolith. Each had a distinct tonal quality that overlapped with the others in what sounded like, "It's a pattern," Sarah whispered. "Listen to the repetition." She was right. The sounds followed a sequence: 3 long growls from beneath us, 2 shorter ones from the cave direction, then a sustained vibration from near the monolith. The pattern repeated with minor variations, like voices adjusting their timing. "Alexander!" Robert pointed toward the ridge. Our guide stood silhouetted against his fire, waving both arms over his head. His voice carried down to us, thin but urgent. "Leave now. Tonight. Not safe." James aimed his microphone toward the ground, adjusting settings on his recorder. Getting nothing but interference. He frowned at the device. "Battery's draining too." I grabbed my radio. "Alexander, what's causing these sounds?" Static crackled for 10 seconds before his voice broke through. "Bad things wake up? Moontime. You must..." The radio died in my hand. I checked the battery compartment. Corroded, as if the batteries had leaked, though I'd installed fresh ones that morning. The growling continued for 17 minutes, then stopped simultaneously from all locations. The silence felt manufactured, like a held breath. I checked my watch. 7:22. "Sound origin points correlate with the concentric rings," I noted. "Cave, center, perimeter." "It's communicating," Sarah said. Her hand trembled slightly as she marked locations on her site map. "The pattern matches some of the repeating symbols from the monolith's middle section." "That's not possible," I said reflexively, though I'd noticed the same correlation. "We should leave," Robert said, his voice tight. "Document what we have and come back with proper equipment." I looked around our camp, the samples we'd collected, the half-completed mapping grid, the undocumented inner rings. We've barely scratched the surface. The university would never approve a return expedition without concrete evidence. "We have evidence," Sarah countered. "Bodies, carvings, structures that defy archaeological precedent. And sounds we can't record," I added. "The committee would dismiss it as ice movement or atmospheric conditions." James returned from his tent with a different recorder. Analog tape, less susceptible to whatever's draining the digital equipment. The growling began again, more intense than before. The vibrations rattled the metal cups on our portable table and sent ripples across the surface of our remaining water. I felt it in my chest cavity, a physical pressure that made breathing harder. "It's getting closer," Robert whispered. I pressed my ear to the ground, feeling the vibrations change pattern. No longer sequenced, but overlapping. Multiple sources producing sound simultaneously, creating discordant harmonics. On the ridge, Alexander's fire blazed larger than before. Through my binoculars, I could see he'd moved his camp 20 yards farther up the slope. His figure paced back and forth, periodically stopping to look down at our position. "Record what you can," I told James. "Robert, help Sarah finish mapping the inner rings. We need data, not speculation." They worked methodically despite the ongoing sounds, measuring distances between structures and documenting the remaining huts. I focused on correlating the sound patterns with the monolith carvings, sketching possible translations in my journal. The growling continued for 3 hours and 12 minutes, occasionally intensifying to a volume that made verbal communication impossible. At 9:44, it ceased completely, leaving a silence so profound I could hear the blood pulsing in my ears. "Anything on the recorder?" I asked James. He rewound the tape and pressed play. We heard only static, punctuated by mechanical clicking. "Magnetic interference," he muttered, like the tape was partially erased. Sarah returned from the final mapping circuit, her headlamp illuminating her pale face. "The temperature around the monolith is 6 degrees warmer than the surrounding area. No obvious heat source." "Could be geothermal," I suggested. "Might explain the sounds. Underground hot springs or steam vents." "Steam doesn't growl in patterns," Robert said. He'd begun organizing his equipment into travel packs. "What are you doing?" I asked. "Being realistic. We've lost our guide. Our equipment is failing, and something under this village makes noise like nothing I've ever heard. We should prepare to leave at first light." I looked at Sarah, who avoided my gaze. James stared at his useless equipment. "We have a scientific obligation," I said carefully. "If we leave now, with partial documentation and equipment failures, the university will write this off as a failed expedition." "And if we stay?" Sarah asked. "What's your explanation for what we're hearing?" I hesitated. "I don't have one yet, that's why we need more time." We agreed to sleep on the decision and retired to our tents, though I doubted any of us would rest easily. I reviewed my notes by headlamp, comparing the sound patterns I'd documented with the monolith carvings. The correlation was unmistakable. The three-part sequences matched the arrangement of figures in the middle section of the stone pillar. At 11:38, I heard Sarah's voice from her nearby tent. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. I switched off my headlamp and listened. The wind had picked up, flowing between the perfectly arranged huts with a soft, fluctuating hiss. "Just wind," I said. "No." Her voice tightened. "There are words in it." I opened my tent flap and peered out. The village lay still under moonlight, the crescent shape hanging above the monolith. Sarah sat at her tent entrance, head tilted toward the structures. "It's saying something about hunger," she said. "About waiting. Sarah, it's wind through stone structures. The geometry creates acoustic effects." She turned to me, her face half illuminated by moonlight. "You've seen everything we've found. The bodies, the carvings. You know this isn't normal. I know we need evidence, not subjective impressions." She shook her head and retreated into her tent without responding. I remained outside, scanning the village layout. The concentric rings created perfect sight lines to the central monolith from every structure, and the cave entrance aligned precisely with the stone pillar and the position of the moon. The design suggested purpose beyond habitation, a monitoring system or observation point. On the ridge, Alexander's fire burned bright against the night sky. Through my binoculars, I could see him sitting upright, rifle across his knees facing our direction. I returned to my tent and tried to sleep, but my mind kept re-examining the evidence, the perfectly preserved structures, the missing skulls, the growling sounds that followed patterns matching the carvings, the cave with its explicit depictions of predation. The original interpretation, a settlement centered around worship, no longer fit the evidence. The monolith wasn't a religious object. It was documentation. Warning. When I finally drifted into uneasy sleep, I dreamed of the carved faces from the upper section of the stone pillar, their expressions not of worship, but of terror, watching something descend from above, something connected to the crescent symbol that now hung in the night sky above our camp. I woke to Sarah's scream cutting through the morning silence. The watch face read 6:17, full dawn light bathing the settlement. I scrambled from my sleeping bag, still dressed from the night before, and unzipped my tent with frozen fingers. Sarah stood 30 yards away near the monolith, her back rigid, right arm extended upward. She didn't move or scream again, just maintained that pointing posture as if paralyzed. "Sarah?" I called, my voice thin in the -15-degree morning air. She didn't respond. I crossed the distance at a half jog, boots crunching through the frost-hardened surface layer. 20 feet out, I registered what had stopped her cold. A human body hung impaled on the monolith's apex, arms stretched outward in a cruciform position. The head was missing, with the same clean separation at the cervical vertebrae we'd observed in the other remains. Blood, still wet enough to glisten in the morning light, traced dark rivulets down the carved symbols, pooling in the deeper grooves. Droplets spattered the snow below with perfectly circular red impressions. "It wasn't there last night," Sarah whispered, her breath clouding before her face. "I checked the site at 4:30 during my watch shift. Nothing." I measured the distance from ground to body with my eyes, at least 19 feet up. No ladder or climbing equipment lay nearby. No footprints surrounded the monolith save our own from previous days. "Robert," I called, not taking my eyes off the corpse. "Bring the camera." The body wore a heavy-duty Soviet-style winter parka with patches on the shoulders, faded Cyrillic lettering still visible on the right patch. The pants were modern Western manufacture, North Face or similar, with tool pockets along the thighs. One boot was missing, revealing a wool sock stained dark at the toes. Robert arrived with his breath ragged, camera clutched in gloved hands. He stopped abruptly, nearly stumbling. "Jesus," he said. "How did it—" He swallowed audibly. "How did it get up there?" "Document everything," I said, stepping back. "Full circuit, close-ups of the blood pattern, wide shots for context." While Robert photographed the scene, I circled the monolith, searching for evidence of how the body had been placed. The stone surface remained smooth and unmarked, with no indication of climbing tools or rope abrasions. The snow surrounding the base showed only our previous footprints, undisturbed since yesterday's documentation work. James emerged from his tent, camera bag slung over one shoulder. He froze mid-stride when he spotted the monolith. "Don't film yet," I called to him. "Let Robert finish the initial documentation." He nodded, face pale beneath his thermal hood. "This is like the others Alexander mentioned?" "Similar," I confirmed. "Same pattern of decapitation, but the previous victims weren't displayed." I studied the body's position more carefully. The arms had been deliberately arranged perpendicular to the torso, mirroring the outstretched posture depicted in the upper carvings on the monolith. The precision of placement suggested purpose rather than convenience. "The clothing," Sarah said, finally lowering her arm. "Late 1980s or early 90s Soviet expedition gear. Consistent with one of the missing teams Alexander mentioned." "Preservation suggests it's been frozen since death," I noted. "Recently thawed and placed here." "By what?" Robert asked, lowering his camera. "And how? That's 20 feet up a smooth stone pillar." I had no answer that fit the physical evidence. "Finish documenting the scene. I need to check something." I returned to camp and retrieved my binoculars, training them on Alexander's ridge position. His fire still smoldered, tent erected, but no movement. I adjusted focus, sweeping the ridge line. The guide stood at its edge, rifle hanging at his side, watching our camp through his own binoculars. When I returned, James had begun filming while Robert collected blood samples from the snow. Sarah mapped the blood spatter pattern, measuring the distance between drops. "The blood is only partially frozen," she reported. "Placed here within the last 2 hours." "Temperature's rising," Robert added, checking his thermometer. -12 now, up 3 degrees since yesterday. I examined the base of the monolith, where blood had pooled in small depressions. "The pattern matches carved channels in the stone," I noted, tracing one groove with my gloved finger. "Deliberate design for fluid routing." James lowered his camera suddenly, face contorting. "What the hell is that?" "What?" I asked, looking where he pointed, the upper section of the monolith beneath the body. "There's something moving in the stone," he said, raising his camera again. "Right there, behind the carvings." I saw nothing but the ancient engravings, obscured in places by blood trails. "It's in the viewfinder," he insisted. "Shapes shifting inside the pillar, like something swimming beneath the surface." Robert approached, peering at James's display screen. His expression changed. "He's right. There's movement visible on camera, but not to the naked eye." I took the camera, studying the digital display. Dark shapes writhed beneath the monolith's surface, fluid organic patterns that didn't match the rigid geometry of the carvings. I looked directly at the stone, seeing nothing unusual, then back at the screen where the movement continued. "Some kind of electromagnetic anomaly affecting the sensor," I suggested, though I didn't believe it. "Or lens refraction from temperature differential." James took his camera back, rewinding the footage he'd just shot. I've been seeing things like this since yesterday. Things that aren't there when I look directly, but show up in playback. He tilted the screen toward me. The video showed our camp from the previous evening, focused on the outer ring of huts. Between two structures, a tall, dark shape moved with deliberate slowness, its proportions wrong for a human figure. Too tall, limbs too long, head oddly elongated. "That's empty space," I said. "There was nothing there." "I know." James clicked through more footage. "It's all contaminated like this. Shapes moving between structures, figures circling our camp, things watching us from the cave entrance." Robert had begun packing equipment into his backpack, movements quick and mechanical. "We need to leave," he said, voice tight. "Now. Today." "We can't just abandon—" I began. "Look at the evidence, Dave." Sarah gestured toward the impaled body. Fresh human remains with the same signature trauma as bodies spanning decades. Unexplainable placement. No footprints, temperatures rising, electronic anomalies. James's footage showing things we can't see. She'd begun gathering her mapping tools. "We have more than enough to justify a full research expedition with proper security." I looked at the monolith again, the body silhouetted against the morning sky. Scientific curiosity warred with primitive instinct. We'd barely scratched the surface of this discovery, yet everything we'd found suggested active danger rather than passive archaeological significance. We document everything thoroughly before departure, I decided. Full notes, sample collection, photographic record. If we're leaving, we're taking conclusive evidence. They agreed, though Robert continued packing between documentation tasks. We worked methodically through the morning, cataloging, sampling, and recording. I filled 17 pages in my field journal with observations, measurements, and sketches of the body's position relative to the monolith carvings. At 11:22, a shout from the ridge drew our attention. Alexander stood at the edge, waving his arms frantically, gesturing for us to leave. His voice carried across the valley in fragmented Siberian accented English. "Not safe! Go now! They come with dark!" I raised my hand to acknowledge him, then turned back to my documentation. The blood samples were nearly complete, and Sarah had finished mapping the body's position. The sky remained clear, with hours of daylight remaining. We had time to finish properly. A mechanical roar erupted from the ridge. I spun to see Alexander running toward his snowmobile, abandoning his tent and supplies. He threw himself onto the vehicle, engine snarling as he gunned it away from the campsite. Within seconds, he disappeared over the far side of the ridge, the sound fading rapidly. "He left us," Robert said, voice hollow. "He actually left." I checked the satellite phone. Still dead despite new batteries. The radio emitted only static. Without Alexander and his snowmobile, we faced a 120-mile trek through Siberian wilderness in worsening conditions. "We finish what we're doing," I said, forcing calm into my voice. "Then pack for departure. We follow the valley southeast until we hit the tributary we crossed 3 days ago. From there, we can follow the water to the last outpost." Sarah nodded, but her gaze kept returning to the ridge where Alexander had fled. What scared him enough to abandon his equipment? I had no answer that fit rational parameters. We completed our documentation by mid-afternoon and consolidated our packs, leaving behind non-essential equipment to lighten our loads for the trek out. As we worked, the temperature continued rising, -8 degrees by 2 o'clock, unseasonably warm for the region and season. James reviewed more footage while we packed, his expression growing increasingly troubled. "The cave," he said finally. "There's something in the footage from the cave that I missed before." He tilted his screen toward me. The video showed the third chamber we discovered, with its scattered skeletons and elaborate wall carvings. But at the far end, visible only for 3 frames as James's light swept past, a narrow opening led deeper into the mountain. "That passage wasn't there," I said, studying the screen. We searched the entire chamber. "It's in the footage," James insisted. "Same place where we heard that scraping sound." I looked toward the northern perimeter where the cave entrance cut into the mountainside. "We should verify before leaving. If there's another chamber, it could contain evidence of what happened here." "We don't have time," Robert argued. 4 hours of daylight left. We need distance between us and this place before dark. "One quick check," I countered. 20 minutes maximum. If there's nothing, we leave immediately." Sarah sided with me, her scientific curiosity temporarily overcoming fear. James agreed to film while Robert reluctantly accompanied us after setting up light beacons around our packed equipment. The cave mouth felt different as we approached, warmer than before, with that same organic smell intensified. My headlamp illuminated the entrance as we ducked inside, following the now familiar path through the first chamber with its worship carvings, then the second with its scattered remains. The third chamber opened before us, skeletons arranged exactly as we'd left them. I swept my light across the far wall where James's footage had shown the passage. Solid stone stared back, unbroken and carved with the same figures we'd documented previously. "Nothing," Robert said, relief evident in his voice. "Camera artifact." "Wait," Sarah said, approaching the wall. "Look at the carvings here compared to our photographs." I pulled out my documentation shots from the previous day, comparing them to the wall before us. The carvings remained identical in style and general content, but specific figures had changed position, the hunched shapes now arranged in a tighter circle around the human figures, their postures more predatory. "That's not possible," I whispered, running my fingers over the altered carvings. The stone felt warm, almost feverish against my skin. A low, vibrating growl shuddered through the chamber, not from any visible source, but seemingly from the stone itself. The sound registered at that same subvocal frequency we'd heard the previous night, but stronger, closer. "We're leaving," Robert said, already backing toward the entrance. "Right now." No one argued. We retreated through the chambers, maintaining documentation protocol despite our quickened pace. At the cave mouth, I turned for one final photograph and noticed a dark fluid seeping from between the stones near the floor, glossy and viscous, too thick for water. The sun hung low as we emerged, casting the settlement in deep orange light. Our packed equipment waited exactly as we'd left it, light beacons blinking steadily. 2 hours of daylight, I noted, checking my watch. We moved southeast along the valley floor, easiest terrain with most direct route to the tributary. "The monolith," Sarah said quietly. I turned to look. The body remained impaled at the top, but its position had changed, arms now hanging at its sides rather than outstretched. No wind strong enough to move a corpse had blown through the valley. "Pack the rest," I ordered, voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding my system. "We leave in 5 minutes." Robert and James grabbed the remaining equipment while Sarah and I did a final check of our site. When we rejoined them, Robert had distributed flares and our emergency medical kit among the packs. "Alexander took our best survival gear," he reported. "We have 4 days of rations if we stretch them, maybe 5. "Should be enough," I said, calculating distances in my head. "If we maintain 8 miles per day, we'll reach the tributary in 3 days. The outpost 2 days after that." We shouldered our packs and began walking southeast, passing between the outer ring of huts. I maintained a steady pace, listening to the rhythm of 4 sets of boots crunching through snow. The impaled body receded behind us, silhouetted against the setting sun. After 20 minutes, I turned to check our trajectory against the ridge line, and froze. The village remained the same distance behind us, the monolith's profile unchanged despite our steady progress away from it. "Stop," I called, dropping my pack. The others halted, turning to follow my gaze. "We haven't moved," Sarah whispered. "How is that possible?" I checked the GPS unit. Dead, screen dark despite new batteries that morning. My compass lay flat in my palm, needle spinning lazily without settling on a direction. "Mark our position," I told Robert. "Drive a pole into the snow. We'll establish a baseline." He complied, hammering one of our survey markers into the frozen ground. We resumed walking, maintaining the same southeast heading for exactly 30 minutes before stopping to check. The marker stood precisely 20 feet behind us. We'd covered less than half the distance we should have, and the village remained clearly visible, central monolith still dominating the landscape. "Circle pattern," Sarah suggested, her scientific mind searching for rational explanation. "We could be walking in a curve without visual reference points." "Sun position argues against that," I countered, though I preferred her explanation to alternatives. "We've maintained straight trajectory relative to sunset." James filmed our surroundings in a slow 360 pan, his earlier reluctance forgotten in the face of this new phenomenon. Through his viewfinder, he suddenly stiffened. "There's something on the ridge," he said, voice barely audible, "where Alexander's camp was." I raised my binoculars, focusing on the abandoned campsite. Alexander's tent remained standing, fire pit cold, equipment scattered where he'd left it. Nothing moved. "I don't see anything," I said. "It's in the camera," James insisted. "Dark shapes, moving around his tent, multiple figures." Robert took James's camera, studied the display, then passed it to me without comment. Through the viewfinder, 7 or 8 tall, shadowy forms moved with deliberate purpose around Alexander's abandoned camp. Their proportions matched nothing I recognized. Too tall, limbs too long, bodies hunched forward at unnatural angles. I looked directly at the ridge with naked eyes. Empty. Back through the viewfinder, dark figures methodically examining Alexander's equipment, heads turning in unison toward our position. "We need shelter," I decided, lowering the camera. "Defensible position until morning." "Where?" Sarah asked. "If we can't leave the valley." I considered our options, weighing the limited evidence against necessary action. The outer ring of huts, stone walls, single entrances we can monitor. "Back to the village?" Robert's voice cracked. "Well, that's the most logical choice," I cut him off. "Solid structures, established perimeter. We set watches and maintain communication." No one offered a better alternative. We returned to the settlement as the last daylight faded, selecting a hut in the outermost ring with intact walls and a hide covering we could secure from inside. The structure's 8-foot diameter provided just enough space for our reduced equipment and 4 sleeping positions. 2-hour watch rotations, I said, arranging our sleeping bags in a spoke pattern. "I'll take first watch. Sarah second, Robert third, James fourth. Standard protocols. Report anything unusual. Maintain hourly radio checks, even if units are compromised." Sarah activated our emergency locator beacon, though we all recognize the slim chances of signal transmission or quick response in this remote region. Robert distributed the remaining working flashlights and checked our fuel reserves for the portable heater. 4 night shifts, if we're conservative, he reported. 5 if we alternate warming periods. "Enough to reach morning," I said. "We reassess at first light." I took position near the doorway, field journal open on my knees, pen ready to document through the night. Outside, darkness settled completely over the village. The waning crescent moon rose above the monolith, casting silver light across the concentric rings of structures. The temperature stopped rising, holding steady at -8 degrees, still unseasonably warm. I logged this anomaly at 8:43, adding it to the growing list of phenomena that defied rational explanation. Sarah sat beside me, though her watch wouldn't begin for another hour. "Alexander knew," she said quietly. "He warned us from the beginning." I nodded, making another note in my journal. Indigenous knowledge often contains practical warnings about local dangers, even when framed in supernatural terms. "You think this is something practical?" she asked. "Something explicable?" I hesitated before answering. "I think there's a natural explanation for everything we've observed. I just don't know what it is yet." She didn't argue, but her silence carried skepticism. Outside, the wind picked up, flowing between the perfectly arranged huts with a sound like distant whispers. I strained to listen, pen poised above paper, ready to document whatever came with the darkness. The temperature stabilized at -8 as full darkness enveloped the village. I noted the time, 8:52 in the evening, and tightened the straps on my headlamp. Outside our stone shelter, the monolith stood silhouetted against the night sky, its carved surface catching fragments of moonlight from the waning crescent that had risen above the eastern ridge. Sarah checked the radio again, receiving only static despite adjusting frequencies. "Signal's completely dead," she reported, her voice measured despite the tension evident in her posture. "Emergency beacon still active, but no confirmation ping." Robert sat cross-legged near our portable heater, methodically disassembling and cleaning the flare gun. His hands trembled slightly as he loaded a fresh cartridge, then placed the weapon within reach on his folded thermal jacket. "4 flares left," he said. "1 loaded, 3 in reserve." I recorded these details in my field journal, maintaining documentation protocol despite our circumstances. James paced the narrow space between our sleeping bags, his camera clutched to his chest like a talisman. "The memory cards are corrupt," he said for the 3rd time in an hour. "Every file I've tried to transfer shows the same visual anomalies, moving shapes where nothing should be." "Electrical interference," I suggested again, though none of us believed it anymore. "Focus on what we can directly observe and document." The first growl came at 9:17, a deep, resonant vibration that traveled through the stone beneath us rather than through air. Unlike the previous night's sounds, this carried distinct directionality, originating from somewhere near the cave entrance. A second growl answered from the opposite side of the settlement, followed by a third from near the monolith. "They're positioning themselves around the perimeter," Sarah whispered, pressing her ear to the stone wall. "Coordinated movement." I dimmed my headlamp and moved toward the hide-covered doorway. The material felt unnaturally warm against my fingertips as I eased it aside, creating a narrow viewing gap. Outside, moonlight silvered the packed snow between structures, creating sharp contrasts between illuminated surfaces and impenetrable shadows. Something moved between the 3rd and 4th rings, a massive shape that seemed to absorb rather than block light. It walked upright, but with a pronounced forward hunch, its head pivoting in smooth, deliberate movements as it examined our abandoned equipment pile near the center. "Movement at the perimeter," I reported, voice steady despite my racing pulse. "Single entity, bipedal, approximately 8 feet tall based on structure height comparison." "Let me see," James insisted, pushing forward with his camera. I held him back with my outstretched arm. No lights, no recording, observation only. The creature stopped beside our portable table, massive arms extending to touch the sample containers we'd left behind. Its proportions defied natural selection. Limbs too long relative to torso, joints articulating in fluid motions that suggested additional flexibility. In the moonlight, I could see dark fur or hair covering its body, thicker around the shoulders and head. A second entity emerged from between structures in the 2nd ring, moving with identical hunched posture. It approached the first, and they pressed their elongated heads together for several seconds. Communication or recognition ritual. Their movements displayed unmistakable intelligence and purpose. The growling intensified, now accompanied by heavy footfalls that vibrated through the frozen ground into the hut walls. I counted 7 distinct sources circling our position, matching the 7 rings of the settlement. 7 entities, I whispered, returning to my journal to record this correlation. Robert checked the flare gun again, his breathing shallow but controlled. "Will the stone walls hold if they attack?" "Unknown," I answered honestly. "Depends on their physical capabilities and intent." A new sound cut through the growling, rhythmic impacts from the direction of the monolith. I returned to the doorway, easing the covering aside with minimal movement. What I saw matched nothing in archaeological or evolutionary record. The largest creature stood before the stone pillar, its height nearly half that of the monolith itself. In the moonlight, I could see its arms raised overhead in a posture that precisely mirrored the carvings on the upper section, its head tilted backward, facing the crescent moon directly. As it held this position, a deep patterned growl emerged from its chest cavity, 3 long pulses followed by 2 short. The other entities formed a circle around the monolith, each assuming identical postures with arms raised. They responded to the leader's call with synchronized vocalizations, a complex, overlapping pattern that created harmonics impossible for human vocal anatomy. "It's a ceremony," Sarah whispered from beside me. "Exactly like the monolith carvings." She was right. The arrangement perfectly matched the circular pattern depicted on the central stone panels. 7 figures surrounding a central pillar, arms upraised toward a crescent symbol. What we'd interpreted as worship carvings were documentary recordings, precise depictions of exactly what now occurred outside our shelter. The ceremony continued for 27 minutes, the vocalizations growing more complex and the movements more elaborate. The leader ran its elongated fingers over the monolith carvings, tracing patterns that caused the stone to emit a faint luminescence where touched. This interaction created a visual rhythm: touch, glow, fade, touch, that pulsed in time with the vocalizations. James had stopped pacing. When I turned to check his position, I found him kneeling beside his equipment bag, assembling his primary camera with night vision attachment. "This changes everything," he whispered, eyes fever bright in the dim shelter. "First documented evidence of non-human intelligence performing ritual behavior. It's a discovery that rewrites anthropology." "James," I said firmly, "we observe only. No documentation until daylight." "You don't understand," he continued, checking his battery pack. "This footage will make history, scientific immortality." Before I could respond, a new sound emerged from the ceremony, a higher-pitched keening that raised the hair on my arms. The leader had produced something from behind the monolith, a dark object roughly spherical in shape. "Is that—" Robert started. "A human skull," Sarah finished, her voice clinical despite the implications. "Consistent with the missing remains we documented." The leader raised the skull toward the crescent moon, and the keening sound intensified as the other entities swayed in unison. The ritual had entered a new phase, its purpose becoming clearer with each passing moment. James moved suddenly, shoving past me toward the doorway. "I need this footage," he hissed, already activating his camera light. I grabbed his sleeve. "You'll get us all killed." He wrenched free with unexpected strength. "They're focused on their ceremony. I can circle behind the outer ring and film from cover." "James," Sarah started, reaching for him. "I'll be right back," he said, ducking through the doorway before we could stop him. I moved to the opening, watching as James crouched low and moved between 2 structures in the outer ring. His camera light bobbed as he ran, a bright pinpoint in the darkness that might as well have been a signal flare. The ceremony stopped abruptly. 7 elongated heads turned in perfect synchronization toward James's moving light. The leader lowered the skull and emitted a single sharp vocalization that cut through the night air like a physical force. "Get back here," I called, voice urgent but controlled. "James, return immediately." He either didn't hear or chose to ignore the command. James continued moving parallel to the ceremonial circle, his camera raised and recording. He reached a position behind one of the inner ring structures, approximately 60 feet from the monolith, and stopped to establish a stable filming position. The leader passed the skull to one of the other entities and moved with impossible speed toward James's position, covering the distance in 3 fluid strides that defied physics. It rounded the structure where James knelt filming and stopped directly behind him, its massive frame blocking the moonlight. "Behind you!" Robert shouted from the doorway, raising the flare gun. James turned too late. The creature seized him by both shoulders, massive hands engulfing his upper arms completely. James's scream cut through the night as the entity lifted him effortlessly until his feet dangled 3 feet above the ground. His camera fell, the light still active, illuminating the snow beneath them. The creature carried James toward the monolith, moving with methodical precision rather than predatory frenzy. The circle parted to allow them passage, then reformed once the leader reached the central position. James's struggles grew weaker, his screams devolving into ragged gasps as the pressure on his shoulders increased. I should have done something. I didn't. None of us did. We watched through the narrow doorway opening as the leader presented James to the monolith like an offering, positioning him directly beneath the moon's crescent shape. What happened next occurred too quickly for complete visual processing. The leader's arms moved in a precise, practiced motion. A wet tearing sound echoed across the settlement, followed by absolute silence. James's body crumpled to the base of the monolith, falling in a posture identical to the remains we'd found earlier. Limbs splayed, neck separated cleanly at the cervical vertebrae. The leader raised something dark and dripping toward the moon. I closed the hide covering and backed away from the doorway, my journal clutched in one hand, pen in the other. I made myself record what we'd witnessed. Times, movements, vocalizations, outcome, while my mind tried to partition the horror into manageable data points. "They'll come for us next," Robert whispered, the flare gun trembling in his hand. "We're trapped." Sarah pressed her ear to the rear wall of the hut. The ceremony's continuing. They've resumed the vocalizations. I checked my watch, 10:14, and considered our options with forced detachment. They appear focused on the ritual. The ceremony seems time-sensitive, aligned with the moon's position. "The cave," Sarah said suddenly. "The carvings showed people seeking shelter there." I reviewed my sketches of the cave imagery. She was right. The deeper carvings depicted human figures in protective positions inside stone enclosures, while the hunting occurred outside. "The specimens we found in the cave died there," Robert pointed out. "How is that safer?" "They died over time," I countered, examining the evidence logically. "Not during a single predation event. The cave may offer temporary sanctuary, perhaps due to some property we haven't identified." Sarah nodded. "The creatures avoid it during their active phase. The bodies we found could be people who sought shelter but couldn't leave before starvation took them." I calculated distances and sight lines. 27 yards to the cave entrance from our current position, 6 structures providing potential cover. Northern approach offers the most concealment. "You want us to run?" Robert asked, incredulous. "With those things out there?" "They're occupied with their ceremony," I said, gathering essential documentation materials, journal, sample containers, 1 camera. "This may be our only opportunity while they're focused on the monolith." Sarah collected her field notes and a water bottle. "The ceremony appears lunar dependent. Once the moon reaches apex, they may shift to hunting behavior." I checked the gaps between structures, plotting our route. We move in sequence. Sarah first, then Robert, then me. 5-second intervals. Stay low, use the structures for cover. No lights, no sound. Robert clutched the flare gun like a talisman. "And if they see us?" "Fire the flare in the opposite direction as distraction, then run directly for the cave entrance." I met their eyes individually. "Ready?" Sarah nodded once, her movements precise and controlled, despite the fear evident in her rigid posture. Robert exhaled slowly, then gave a short nod. I eased the hide covering aside and scanned the settlement. The ceremony continued around the monolith, all 7 entities engaged in synchronized movements that kept their attention focused inward. James's body remained crumpled at the base, his camera light still illuminating a small circle of blood-stained snow. "Now," I whispered to Sarah. Go. She slipped through the opening and moved like a shadow between the first two structures, crouching behind the second hut's wall. 5 seconds later, Robert followed, his path slightly wider but equally silent. He reached Sarah's position and pressed against the stone beside her. I gathered the remaining essential materials, secured my pack, and moved through the doorway. The frigid air bit through my layers as I crouched, scanning for any reaction from the ceremonial circle. The entities remained focused on the monolith, their vocalizations growing more intense as the moon climbed higher. I reached Sarah and Robert behind the structure and pointed toward our next coverage point, a hut in the second ring that would place us halfway to the cave entrance. Sarah moved first, covering the distance in a practiced crouch that minimized her profile. Robert followed, his movement less fluid but equally determined. As I prepared to follow, a change in the vocalization pattern caught my attention. The leader had raised James's skull again, this time positioning it atop the monolith in a carved depression I hadn't noticed during our examination. The placement completed some circuit. The entire stone pillar began to emit a faint blue luminescence from within, light pulsing through the carved channels where blood had flowed earlier. I forced myself to move, staying low as I joined the others behind the second structure. From this position, we had clear line of sight to the cave entrance, roughly 15 yards across open ground. 2 more structures provided potential cover along the way. Almost there, I whispered. Same sequence, next position. Sarah tensed to move, then froze. The vocalizations had stopped abruptly, leaving an unnatural silence across the settlement. I peered around the edge of our shelter and saw the leader standing perfectly still, its elongated head turned in our direction. It knew we were moving. Go now, I urged, abandoning the measured approach. Straight for the cave. Don't stop. Sarah bolted first, running in a low crouch toward the next structure. Robert followed 3 steps behind her, flare gun clutched in his right hand. I moved last, scanning behind us as I ran. The leader emitted a single, sharp vocalization. The ceremonial circle broke formation instantly, entities dispersing in different directions with purposeful speed. 2 moved directly to intercept our path to the cave. Sarah reached the third structure and pressed against its wall, breathing hard but controlled. 2 incoming, she reported, voice clinical despite the circumstances. Robert raised the flare gun. I'll fire when they're closer. Better distraction. I joined them, calculating trajectories and timing. Wait until they commit to a direction. We need maximum confusion. The 2 entities approached from different angles, their movements suggesting coordinated hunting tactics rather than random pursuit. They maintained communication through low-frequency vocalizations that vibrated through the ground beneath our feet. 10 seconds, I whispered. On my mark. The nearest entity paused, head swiveling as it scanned our position. In the moonlight, I could see its face clearly for the first time. Not furred like the body, but smooth, dark skin stretched over an elongated skull. Where eyes should have been, twin points of red luminescence pulsed with the same rhythm as the monolith. Now, I said. Robert aimed the flare gun away from the cave entrance and fired. The magnesium charge ignited with a sharp crack, sending the bright projectile arcing over the settlement. It illuminated the entire village in harsh red light, casting distorted shadows across the snow. The entities reacted immediately, 3 of them moving toward the flare's landing point beyond the southern perimeter. The 2 nearest us hesitated, caught between the distraction and our scent or sound. Run, I ordered, straight for the cave. Sarah sprinted across the open ground, her boots finding purchase on the hard-packed snow. Robert followed, slightly slower due to his heavier pack. I brought up the rear, maintaining awareness of the entity's positions as we ran. The cave entrance appeared ahead, a dark void in the mountainside. Sarah reached it first, ducking into the opening without hesitation. Robert was 4 steps behind her when one of the creatures changed direction, abandoning the flare distraction to pursue us with terrifying speed. "Faster!" I called to Robert, who glanced back and saw the entity closing the distance. He reached the cave entrance and disappeared inside. I was 3 steps from safety when I felt the air pressure change behind me, a displacement caused by something large moving at speed. I dove forward, momentum carrying me toward the opening. Pain exploded across my back as something raked from shoulder to hip, claws or talons tearing through my thermal layers and into flesh beneath. The force accelerated my dive, sending me tumbling through the cave entrance as a massive shadow blocked the moonlight behind me. I hit the stone floor and rolled deeper into the passage, warm wetness spreading across my back. Sarah grabbed my shoulders and pulled me farther from the entrance as Robert aimed the reloaded flare gun at the opening. The entity stopped precisely at the threshold, its massive frame filling the entrance without crossing it. In the dim light filtering past its body, I could see its red eyes fixed on us, head tilting as if considering options. It extended one elongated arm toward me, claws still wet with my blood, then withdrew without entering. "It won't come in," Sarah whispered, applying pressure to my back wounds, just like the carvings showed. The creature remained at the entrance for 73 seconds by my watch, then withdrew with deliberate movements. Its vocalization as it retreated sounded almost like frustration, a complex pattern of low frequencies that resonated through the stone around us. "The carvings were warnings," I said, voice steady despite the burning pain across my back. "Instructions for survival." Sarah examined my injuries by headlamp, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. 4 parallel lacerations, shoulder to lumbar region. Deep but not life-threatening if we prevent infection. Robert kept watch at the entrance, flare gun ready. "They're returning to the monolith," he reported, ceremony continuing. I pushed myself to sitting position, ignoring the pain to focus on our situation. "We need to document everything we've witnessed. The university needs to understand what we've found here." "They killed James," Robert said, his clinical tone failing to mask his horror. "Just like the others. Just like they'll kill us if we leave this cave." "We're safe for now," I replied, forcing myself to think procedurally rather than emotionally. "The lunar cycle dictates their behavior patterns. We need to understand the timing." Sarah finished bandaging my wounds with our field medical kit. "Based on the carvings and ceremony progression, I estimate their active phase correlates with the crescent moon position, perhaps 3 to 4 days total." I recorded this assessment in my journal, along with detailed descriptions of the entity's physical characteristics, movements, and vocalizations. "We have water for 4 days if rationed carefully. The cave appears to offer protection, though we don't understand why. The original inhabitants must have discovered this sanctuary," Sarah suggested, examining the carvings visible in our headlamp beams. "They built the village to monitor the creature's activities, using the cave during active phases." Robert remained fixated on the entrance. I motioned to Sarah and Robert to gather close, keeping my voice just above a whisper. "We need to reach the cave, now," while they're focused on the ceremony. The vibrations from the entity's vocalizations traveled through the stone hut, masking our movements as we collected essential gear. Sarah stuffed her notebook and a water bottle into her pack while Robert checked the flare gun again, his knuckles white around the grip. "The northern approach offers the most cover," I explained, sketching a quick route in the dust on the floor. "Move between huts 5 seconds apart. Keep low and silent." I eased the hide covering aside just enough to scan the settlement. The 7 entities remained arranged around the monolith, their massive frames silhouetted against the glowing stone. James's body lay crumpled at the base, his limbs splayed at unnatural angles. The crescent moon hung directly above the ceremonial circle, casting silver light across the concentric rings of structures. "Wait for my signal," I whispered, watching the rhythmic movements of the largest entity as it traced patterns on the monolith surface. Sarah first, then Robert, then me. When the leader tilted its elongated head upward to face the moon, I nodded to Sarah. She slipped through the doorway and moved with practiced efficiency between the first two structures, crouching behind the wall of the second hut. Her breath clouded in the -8-degree air, dissipating quickly in the stillness. Robert followed after 5 measured seconds, hunched low with the flare gun clutched against his chest. He reached Sarah's position without incident, pressing his back against the stone beside her. I secured my field journal inside my jacket and moved through the opening, careful to let the hide covering fall back naturally. The frigid air bit through my layers as I crouched, scanning for any reaction from the ceremonial circle. The entities remained fixated on their ritual, vocalizations intensifying as the moon climbed higher. I joined Sarah and Robert behind the outer structure, then pointed toward our next position, a hut in the second ring that would place us halfway to the cave entrance. Sarah nodded once and moved first, maintaining her crouch as she crossed the open space. Robert followed, less fluid but equally determined. As I prepared to join them, the leader raised something above its head, a dark object that caught the moonlight with a dull gleam. The skull. James's skull, freshly separated and now presented to the crescent moon as the ceremony reached some culmination point. I forced myself to move, muscles burning with controlled speed as I joined the others behind the second structure. From our new position, the cave entrance lay visible across 15 yards of open ground, its dark mouth cut into the mountainside beyond the settlement perimeter. 2 more positions, then straight to the cave, I whispered, feeling a thin layer of sweat freezing against my skin despite the cold. Same order, same spacing. Sarah tensed to move, then froze. The vocalizations had stopped abruptly. I peered around the edge of our shelter and saw the leader standing perfectly still, its elongated head turned in our direction, the red points of luminescence where eyes should have been pulsed with sudden intensity. "It knows we're moving," I said, abandoning our measured approach. "Go now. Straight for the cave. Don't stop." Sarah bolted first, running in a low crouch across the open space between huts. Robert followed 3 steps behind, flare gun raised and ready. I moved last, maintaining awareness of our surroundings as the distance to safety slowly decreased. Sarah had nearly reached the next structure when she faltered, her stride breaking as her gaze locked onto something in the snow. James's camera lay where it had fallen, its light still glowing, illuminating the blood-soaked ground where his body had been. The body itself was gone, dragged or carried to the monolith during the ceremony. "Keep moving," Robert urged, grabbing her elbow and pulling her forward. A single sharp vocalization cut through the night air. The ceremonial circle broke formation instantly, entities dispersing in different directions with deliberate purpose. 2 moved to intercept our path to the cave, covering ground with impossible speed. Sarah reached the 3rd structure with Robert beside her. I joined them seconds later, chest burning from exertion in the cold air. "They're coming from both sides," Sarah reported, voice clinical despite her rapid breathing. "Coordinated flanking approach." Robert raised the flare gun. "I'll fire when they commit. Create maximum confusion." I calculated distances and trajectories, watching as the nearest entity paused to communicate with the others through low-frequency growls that vibrated the ground beneath our boots. In the moonlight, I could see its face clearly, smooth dark skin stretched over an elongated skull with twin points of red luminescence pulsing where eyes should have been. "On my count," I said, gauging the cave entrance distance against the entity's positions. 3, 2, 1. Robert aimed the flare gun away from the cave entrance and fired. The magnesium charge ignited with a sharp crack, sending the bright projectile arcing over the settlement. Harsh red light momentarily washed over the entire village, casting distorted shadows across the snow. "Run!" I ordered. "Straight for the cave. Don't look back." Sarah burst from cover, sprinting across the open ground with Robert 3 steps behind her. I followed, pushing through the burning pain in my thighs as I covered the distance. Behind us, 3 entities moved toward the flare's landing point while 2 others adjusted course to pursue us. The cave entrance gaped ahead, a dark void in the mountainside. Sarah reached it first, disappearing into the darkness without hesitation. Robert followed, his breathing ragged as he crossed the threshold 4 steps behind her. I was 3 strides from safety when the air pressure changed behind me, a displacement caused by something massive moving at speed. A roar built from multiple throats shook the ground, vibrations traveling through the frozen soil into my bones. I dove forward as something raked across my back, hot pain erupting from shoulder to hip as claws or talons tore through my thermal layers and into flesh beneath. The force accelerated my momentum, sending me tumbling through the cave entrance as a massive shadow blocked the moonlight behind me. I hit the stone floor and rolled deeper into the passage, warm wetness spreading across my back and freezing almost immediately against my skin. Sarah grabbed my shoulders and pulled me farther from the entrance as Robert reloaded the flare gun with trembling hands. "Don't," I managed, the words tight through clenched teeth. "Save it." The largest entity filled the entrance, its massive frame silhouetted against the night sky. It extended one elongated arm toward me, claws still wet with my blood gleaming in the faint light. Its head tilted as if in curiosity or frustration, red eyes pulsing as it studied us. But it didn't enter. The creature remained perfectly still at the threshold, arm extended but not crossing into the cave. After 74 seconds by my watch, it withdrew with deliberate movements, a complex vocalization rumbling from its chest that sounded almost like frustration. "It won't come in," Sarah whispered, applying pressure to my back wounds, just like the carvings showed. Robert kept the flare gun aimed at the entrance, his breathing gradually steadying. There are more gathering outside. They're watching but staying back. Robert remained fixated on the entrance where the entities maintained their vigil. Then why are there skeletons deeper in the cave? Why did those people die if this place is safe? I turned my attention to the tunnel leading deeper into the mountain, where our previous exploration had revealed chambers filled with headless remains. The protection might be temporary or conditional. Outside, the ceremonial vocalizations resumed as several entities returned to the monolith, leaving 3 to guard the cave entrance. The harmonics created a physical pressure against my eardrums, forcing me to cover them briefly. "We need to understand the limitations," I said, wincing as I shifted position. "The deeper chambers might contain information about duration or escape methods." Sarah checked her watch. "It's nearly midnight. We should rest first, conserve strength and resources. You're injured, and we all need to process what we've witnessed." I nodded, acknowledging the logic while making detailed notes about the entity's behavior in my journal. The facts required documentation, regardless of our survival chances. What we'd discovered wasn't just an archaeological site, but an ongoing predation cycle that had continued for centuries. "We'll organize watches," I decided. 4-hour rotations. I'll take first. "No," Sarah interrupted, her tone leaving no room for argument. "You're injured and need rest. Robert will take first watch, then me, then you, if you're stable." Robert positioned himself near the entrance, flare gun across his knees. "I'll wake you if anything changes." I handed him my journal. "Document everything you observe. Times, positions, behaviors, especially any patterns in the vocalizations." Sarah helped me move deeper into the passage, creating a makeshift bed from our emergency blankets. The pain across my back had settled into a throbbing heat, each movement sending fresh waves of fire through the torn flesh. As I lay on my side, facing the tunnel that led to the deeper chambers, my headlamp illuminated carvings I hadn't noticed during our initial exploration. The images showed human figures arranged in a familiar pattern, 7 concentric circles around a central pillar. Above them, carved with precise detail, loomed a crescent symbol with lines radiating downward toward the humans below. The original village hadn't been built by the creature's worshippers. It had been constructed by their prey, who had developed a system to monitor the predation cycle. The stone structures, the precise arrangement, the monolith itself, all designed to track and perhaps predict the entity's appearances. And the cave had offered temporary sanctuary, just as it did for us now. But the deeper chambers with their headless remains suggested the protection had limits that the previous occupants had discovered too late. "Sarah," I said, voice low to avoid disturbing Robert's watch. "Look at these carvings." She moved closer, examining the images in the narrow beam of my headlamp, the village layout, and the lunar phase. Not just any phase, the same crescent we're experiencing now. I traced the carved lines with my fingertip. They documented the cycle, warned about the hunting phase, showed where to hide. "But they still died here," she whispered, her clinical detachment slipping momentarily. "All of them. Just like we will if we can't find a way out." I studied the progression of images that continued deeper into the tunnel. There might be more information ahead. The third chamber could contain the rest of the record. "From the cave entrance," Robert's voice called softly. "They're leaving the entrance, returning to the monolith." I pushed myself up despite Sarah's protests, moving carefully to join Robert at his observation position. Outside, the entities had withdrawn from the cave mouth, their massive forms now gathered around the central stone pillar where the ceremony continued with increasing intensity. The monolith glowed with blue luminescence, pulsing in rhythm with their synchronized movements. The crescent moon hung directly above, its light caught and amplified by something atop the stone column, James's skull, positioned precisely to catch and reflect the lunar rays. "They'll be occupied until moonset," I said, watching their ritualistic patterns. "That gives us approximately 6 hours before they might return their attention to us." Robert lowered the flare gun slightly. "What happens when the ceremony ends?" I considered the carvings we'd seen throughout the cave system, the progression of images telling a story of cyclical predation. Based on the evidence, they'll either return to hibernation until the next lunar phase or they'll hunt more actively, Sarah finished, her voice steady, looking for additional specimens to complete whatever cycle the ceremony initiated. I made another note in my journal, documenting times and behavioral observations with scientific detachment. Understanding the pattern might be our only chance for survival when protection inevitably failed. We rest in rotation, I decided. Conserve strength and resources. Tomorrow we explore the deeper chambers, look for any information about duration or escape methods. As Sarah helped me back to the makeshift bed, I noticed more carvings illuminated by our movement. Images showing human figures deeper in the cave system, while the hunched shapes patrolled outside. But the final carvings in the sequence showed the creatures eventually entering, moving through passages that had previously protected their prey. The sanctuary was temporary. The village builders had discovered this too late, leaving their warning carved in stone for future victims to find, if they could interpret it correctly before the cycle claimed them as well. Outside, the ceremony intensified under the apex of the crescent moon, vocalizations merging into harmonics that vibrated through the mountain itself. I closed my eyes, focusing on cataloging sensory input rather than interpreting implications. The facts would save us if anything could. I woke to fluorescent light and antiseptic smell. A steady electronic beeping kept time with my pulse while something tugged at my left arm whenever I shifted. Hospital. The realization came slowly, pushing through layers of medication and disorientation. My back felt wrong, tight and numb simultaneously. When I tried to sit up, fire spread across my shoulder blades down to my hip. The wounds. Memory returned in fragments. Running toward the cave, something raking across my back, tumbling through the entrance. "He's awake," someone said. Sarah's voice, hoarse with exhaustion. A face appeared above me. Female, mid-50s, with rectangular glasses and short gray hair. "Mr. Martinez, I am Dr. Petrova. You are in Central Republican Hospital, Yakutsk. Do you understand?" I managed a nod, throat too dry for speech. The doctor offered a plastic cup with a straw. The water tasted metallic but washed away the worst of the cottony dryness. "What day?" I asked, cataloging surroundings. Standard hospital room, window showing gray overcast sky, IV stand, monitoring equipment. "Thursday, March 15th, Dr. Petrova answered. "You have been here for 26 hours. Your wounds required 43 stitches and antibiotics, but there is no sign of internal damage." Sarah moved into view, standing at the foot of the bed. Dark circles beneath her eyes, unwashed hair pulled back, wearing the same thermal layer she'd had in the cave, but with a borrowed jacket over it. Robert stood beside her, looking much the same, but with a bandage across his left temple. "The entities," I said, my voice stronger. "The cave." "They left at dawn," Robert said, his tone flat, clinical, like someone flipped a switch when the moon set. "We waited another 2 hours to be sure." I tried to organize the fragmented timeline. "How did we get here?" "Evenk hunters found us," Sarah explained. 8 of them on snowmobiles with rifles. They'd been tracking the entity's activity and came when they went dormant. Dr. Petrova checked the monitors and made a notation on her tablet. "The hunters brought you to the village of Konu, where you received initial treatment before transfer here by helicopter. You had lost significant blood and were hypothermic." I processed this information methodically. "James?" Sarah and Robert exchanged glances. "They recovered his body," Sarah said finally. "What was left? It's being prepared for transport back to the United States." The doctor adjusted something on my IV line. "I will increase pain medication slightly. You should not move your back too much for at least 48 hours. "The hunters," I said, focusing on facts rather than implications. "You said they were tracking the entities?" The door opened before Sarah could answer. A woman entered, late 60s, with silver-white hair braided down her back and dark eyes that assessed everything in the room with a single sweep. She wore a mixture of traditional and modern clothing, wool pants and insulated boots beneath an elaborately embroidered vest over a flannel shirt. Multiple necklaces of bone and silver hung at her throat, clicking softly as she moved. "Anna Volkov," she introduced herself without preamble. "Elder of Evenk people from Konu region, my hunters found you." "Thank you," I said, studying her weathered face. "You saved our lives." Anna made a dismissive gesture with one hand. "Saved you this time, not forever. They know you now." Dr. Petrova sighed with practiced tolerance. "Anna, Mr. Martinez needs rest, not stories." "Not stories," Anna replied sharply. "Truth. His blood is in them now. They will hunt him when they wake again." The doctor shook her head and checked my bandages with professional efficiency. "I will return in 1 hour. Try not to excite yourself." After she left, Anna moved closer to the bed. Robert brought her a chair without being asked, and she sat with the straight-backed posture of someone who had never required orthopedic intervention despite her age. "You entered the sacred valley," she said, no question in her tone. "You disturbed the sleepers. You saw the stone pillar, yes?" "Yes," I confirmed, shifting slightly to face her better despite the pain. "We documented an archaeological site with 7 concentric rings of stone structures around a central monolith." Anna nodded once. "The Watchers built that place, to monitor, to warn, to sacrifice when necessary." "Sacrifice?" Sarah asked, moving to stand at the side of my bed. "The entities appeared in our land centuries ago," Anna explained, her accent thickening as she spoke. "They take people when the crescent moon hangs in certain position. The old ones built the village to watch for signs, to track the cycles, to prepare. I thought of the carvings, the progression from daily activities to worship to terror. The villagers initially worshipped the entities. They offered gifts first, Anna confirmed. Food, tools, animal skins. When that failed, they offered people. Volunteers at first, then chosen ones. The monolith documented the progression, Sarah said, her analytical mind working despite exhaustion. From appeasement to predation. Anna's dark eyes held mine. For many generations, the Watchers maintained balance, provided sacrifices when the moon cycle came. The entities took what was offered and returned to sleep beneath the mountain. Robert leaned against the wall, arms crossed. What changed? Why did they kill everyone? The last generation refused to continue, Anna said simply. They believed they could hide instead of sacrifice. They were wrong. I recalled the headless skeletons in the cave, people who had sought sanctuary and found only delayed death. The cave protected us temporarily. The rock there contains metals that mask human scent, confuse their senses, Anna explained, but they learn, adapt, eventually enter. You've known about these entities all this time? I asked. Why hasn't anyone documented them scientifically? Anna gave me a look that conveyed decades of dealing with academic arrogance. Many have tried. Some listen to warnings and leave. Others insist on seeing. Those never return to publish findings. The Soviet researcher we found, Sarah said, from 1962. There have been many, Anna confirmed. Scientific teams, military expeditions, curious foreigners, all warned. Few listen. I focused on gathering information methodically. How do you monitor them? Track their activity cycles? Anna reached into her vest pocket and removed a folded paper, spreading it carefully on the bed beside my arm. It contained a hand-drawn chart with lunar phases mapped against calendar dates, specific crescents marked with red circles. They awaken 4 times each year when crescent moon reaches exact position over valley, active for 3 to 4 days, depending on weather and moon visibility, then dormant until next cycle. I studied the chart, noting the precision of the astronomical observations despite the traditional format. Your people have tracked them for generations. We maintain safe distance, observe, warn others. Anna refolded the chart. Your team disturbed beginning of new cycle. They are fully awake now for first time in decades. The implications settled heavily. The other expeditions encountered them during partial awakening cycles. Anna nodded. Usually 1 or 2 entities emerge, take what they need, return to hibernation. Your presence, your machines, your lights, your recordings, you woke all 7. And the monolith? Sarah asked. What purpose does it serve? Communication beacon, Anna said. The stone absorbs moonlight, transmits signals deep below where they hibernate. The carvings record their hunting methods, their feeding requirements. Robert pushed away from the wall. Why don't authorities close off the area? Prevent people from going there? Anna's expression conveyed decades of frustration. We report. Officials investigate, find nothing. Entities only appear during specific lunar alignment. Investigators come at wrong times, see empty village, dismiss reports as superstition. The tribal hunting party, I said, returning to immediate concerns. They knew to come at dawn. We watch from safe distance during active phases, Anna confirmed. When entities return to hibernation, we check for survivors, remove bodies when possible. How many people have they killed? Sarah asked. In my lifetime? Perhaps 30. Anna's face remained impassive. Before formal records, hundreds. The original village held 78 people according to our oral history. None survived. I processed this information with forced detachment. Alexander knew. That's why he wouldn't enter the valley. Alexander Petrov lost his brother to them 15 years ago, Anna said. He guides scientists to the ridge, but knows better than to descend. You said they know us now? I said, focusing on her earlier comment. What does that mean exactly? Anna studied me with unsettling intensity. They mark those who see them. Your blood, your scent. They carry it with them. They can find you. Find us where? Robert asked, tension evident in his posture. Back at the site? Anywhere, Anna replied simply. When they wake for next cycle, they will hunt those they have marked. Distance provides no protection. The monitoring equipment registered my increased heart rate, but I kept my voice even. You're suggesting they can track specific individuals across continents? They are not animals, Anna said. Not as you understand them. They exist partially in this world, partially in another. Physical distance means little. Sarah moved closer to my bed. That's not scientifically possible. Neither is a perfectly preserved prehistoric village, Anna countered. Neither is coordinated hunting behavior from unknown entities. Neither is the corruption of all electronic equipment in their presence. I thought of the footage James had tried to capture. The camera batteries that had drained instantly in the cave, the satellite phone failures. Evidence that supported Anna's impossible claims. If what you're saying is true, I said carefully, we remain in danger even after leaving Siberia. Yes. Anna's directness held no attempt at softening the reality. When Crescent Moon returns to position, they will hunt you. This is certain. Robert began pacing the small room. So, we're just supposed to wait to be killed. There's nothing we can do. There are methods to confuse them temporarily, Anna said. Certain minerals, specific preparations. My people have developed protections over generations, not perfect, but they help. When is the next cycle? I asked, my mind calculating variables and possibilities. Anna consulted an actual paper calendar from her pocket. First night of next cycle begins April 8th, 24 days from now. We'll be back in the United States by then, Sarah said, as if distance might negate Anna's warning, despite her explicit statement to the contrary. They found people in Moscow after Tunguska expedition in 1927, Anna said. Found researchers in Leningrad who never visited site but handled artifacts. Found photographer in Japan who only developed film from site. I absorbed this information methodically. You're describing a coordinated international hunting capability. They follow connections, Anna explained. Blood, touch, images, knowledge. Strongest link is seeing them directly. Second is blood contact. Third is handling objects they have touched. Sarah and Robert had both directly observed the entities. I had been wounded by one, creating the blood connection Anna described as second strongest. All three of us had handled materials from the site, creating the tertiary connection as well. How do we break these connections? I asked, focusing on solutions rather than implications. Some can be weakened, Anna said. I will provide preparations before you leave. But primary connection, being seen by them seeing you, cannot be broken. Dr. Petrova returned, checking her watch with pointed emphasis. Anna, visiting hours end in 10 minutes. My patient needs rest. Anna stood, her movements measured and deliberate. I will return tomorrow with materials. Prepare for your departure. She fixed her gaze on me. When you leave hospital, come to my home in Konu before returning to America. Much to discuss. After she left, Dr. Petrova adjusted my medication again. You should not concern yourself with local legends, Mr. Martinez. Focus on recovery. I nodded without arguing. The doctor had no context for evaluating our experience, no framework for understanding what we'd witnessed. After she left, I turned to Sarah and Robert. The university research team, I said quietly. Have you contacted them? Sarah nodded. I spoke with Dean Whitaker yesterday. He's arranged emergency evacuation flights for us once you're cleared for travel. The official story is that we encountered hostile wildlife and lost James in the attack. Hostile wildlife, Robert repeated with a hollow laugh. That's one way to put it. I considered our options with methodical precision. We need Anna's information, whatever protection she can provide. You can't possibly believe all that, Sarah said, though her tone lacked conviction. Interdimensional hunters tracking us across continents. It's mythology constructed to explain local predator attacks. I watched something tear off James's head with surgical precision. I replied evenly. I felt claws cut through my back. I observed entities that communicated through subsonic frequencies and performed complex ritualistic behaviors. None of this matches known terrestrial predators. Robert sat heavily in the chair Anna had vacated. I keep thinking about the equipment failures. Every battery drained, every recording corrupted, like they can manipulate electromagnetic fields. Or exist partially outside our standard physical laws, I added, remembering the way they moved, fluid motions that defied normal joint limitations. Sarah pressed her palms against her eyes. If Anna's right, we're already dead. They'll find us wherever we go. Not necessarily, I countered, my mind working through possibilities. We have 24 days until the next cycle, time to research, prepare, develop countermeasures. Based on tribal superstition? Sarah asked. Based on direct observational evidence from people who have studied these entities for generations, I corrected, combined with our own documentation and experience. Dr. Petrova returned with a nurse who administered another medication through my IV line. You must rest now. Your friends can return tomorrow morning. Sarah squeezed my hand briefly. We'll be back first thing. The university sent funds for a hotel nearby. As they left, I found myself focusing on Anna's lunar chart. The precision of the cycle tracking suggested decades of careful observation, not superstitious guesswork. If the entity's hunting behavior corresponded to specific lunar positions, there might be astronomical or gravitational factors influencing their activity patterns. The medication began to take effect, making it difficult to maintain focus. I closed my eyes, intending to organize my thoughts about Anna's revelations, but instead found myself replaying the moment in the cave entrance. The entity's elongated arm reaching toward me, claws still wet with my blood, red eyes pulsing as it studied us from the threshold. It had seen me, marked me, and according to Anna, it would find me again when the crescent moon returned to position on April 8th, regardless of where I had gone or how far I had traveled. Sleep took me before I could fully process this implication, dragging me down into darkness where something waited, patient and hungry, already tracking the scent of my blood across impossible distances. The fluorescent lights of Logan International washed out everyone's complexion, making Sarah look sickly, and Robert worse as we collected our bags from the carousel. My back throbbed beneath 43 stitches and layers of bandages. The doctor had warned against air travel, but I'd signed the waiver anyway. 22 hours after leaving Yakutsk, we stood in Boston surrounded by normal people leading normal lives. My brother's waiting outside, Robert said, checking his phone. His voice had flattened since the cave, all enthusiasm erased. Need a ride? I shook my head. University sent a car. Sarah hefted her backpack, wincing as the weight settled. None of us had fully recovered. We should discuss our official statement before meeting with Dean Whitaker tomorrow. Hostile wildlife attack, I recited mechanically. Equipment failure due to extreme conditions. Accidental death of team member. The words tasted like ash. Robert glanced toward the exit. I'm not attending the debriefing. That wasn't a request, I reminded him. The university funded... I quit, he interrupted. Effective immediately. Emailed my withdrawal from the program yesterday. Sarah's face remained carefully neutral. We need consistency in our accounts. Tell them whatever you want. Robert gripped the handle of his roller bag until his knuckles whitened. I'm going to my parents' farm in Vermont, changing my number tomorrow. I understood his decision more than I wanted to admit. I watched him walk away, shoulders hunched beneath his jacket, looking nothing like the eager graduate student who'd documented soil samples in the valley. Another casualty that wouldn't appear in official reports. The university sedan waited at the curb, driver holding a sign with my name. Sarah and I rode in silence through darkened streets, streetlights casting rhythmic patterns across her face. She stared out the window, right hand unconsciously tracing crescent shapes on her thigh. "I filed for emergency leave," she said finally. 6 months, effective next week." I nodded. Reasonable. "My cousin lives in Melbourne." Her voice remained carefully neutral. Southern Hemisphere, different lunar cycle. I tracked the implications without comment. Anna's warnings had affected all of us, whether we acknowledged them aloud or not. The car dropped Sarah at her apartment first. I helped unload her bags, noting how she scanned the street before unlocking her door. The movement wasn't paranoid, just practical adaptation to new understanding. "I'll see you at the debriefing," I said. She paused in the doorway. "They won't believe us if we tell the truth. And we can't protect anyone without credibility." "I know." I handed her the last bag. "Get some rest." My own apartment felt smaller than I remembered. I dropped my bags inside the door and conducted a methodical check of the space. Windows secured, closets empty, bathroom clear. Normal procedure after returning from any extended absence, not response to irrational fear. The scratch on my door caught my attention during the second inspection pass. 3 parallel lines across the metal surface, each approximately 4 inches long, positioned just above the deadbolt. The marks looked fresh, paint curled back to reveal bare metal beneath. No maintenance had been scheduled during my absence according to the building notification system. I photographed the scratches from multiple angles, then checked the hallway security camera feed through the tenant portal. The recording showed normal activity until March 18th, when the feed displayed static between 2:17 and 3:44 in the morning. When the image cleared, the scratches were visible on my door. I reinforced the entrance with a chair beneath the handle before unpacking essential items. The satellite phone from Anna Volkov sat atop my clothes, wrapped in oilcloth with a handwritten note containing a series of numbers. She'd pressed it into my hand before we left Konu, along with a small leather pouch of mineral compounds that smelled of copper and crushed herbs. "When they come," she'd said, "call this number. We will guide you." I hadn't promised to call. Scientists don't rely on tribal remedies against interdimensional predators. But I placed the phone on my nightstand, within easy reach. Sleep came reluctantly. I dreamed of the monolith, blue light pulsing through carved channels while something massive moved just beyond my field of vision. Low-frequency growls vibrated through the stone beneath me, coordinated and deliberate. I woke at 3:12 in the morning, sheets damp with sweat, the dreams clinging like cobwebs. The university debriefing lasted 4 hours and 17 minutes. Dean Whitaker and the research committee documented our statements while representatives from risk management and legal affairs took separate notes. Sarah delivered her account with clinical precision, describing a predator attack without specifying species. I confirmed her version while presenting weather data, equipment logs, and our guide's abandonment as contributing factors. Neither of us mentioned the monolith carvings, ceremonial behaviors, or impossibly preserved village structures. "And the scratches on James's body?" Dean Whitaker asked, reading from the Yakutsk Medical Examiner's preliminary report. "Consistent with large predator claws," I answered. "Possibly wolverine or bear, though we didn't observe the animal directly." The risk management director made a notation. "And you saw nothing unusual about the village structures themselves? Nothing worth protecting for future research?" Sarah kept her face impressively neutral. Standard prehistoric construction, severely compromised by environmental conditions, nothing warranting continued investment. The committee accepted our assessment, expressing appropriate condolences for James while confirming insurance coverage for medical expenses. The university would coordinate with James's family regarding funeral arrangements once his remains cleared international processing. I returned to my apartment and pulled down the astronomical reference texts from my bookshelf. The lunar calendar showed clear progressions through each phase, but I needed precise data on positioning. I logged into the university's observatory database, downloaded orbital tracking information, and cross-referenced with Anna's handwritten chart. April 8th marked the next crescent phase that would position the moon directly above Massachusetts between 12:14 and 1:47 in the morning, 19 days from now. I calculated angles, elevations, and viewing positions based on Boston's latitude and longitude. The crescent would achieve identical positioning relative to Boston as it had over the Siberian village during our encounter with the entities. I checked a global tracker to confirm the April 8th crescent would be visible across the northern hemisphere. The Antarctic research stations at McMurdo and Amundsen Scott would experience midday sun during that period. No moon visibility whatsoever. I checked seasonal staffing protocols, finding that April marked the beginning of winter crew rotation with limited incoming personnel slots potentially available. I made 3 phone calls to colleagues with Antarctic program connections. The conversation with Dr. Reynolds at Woods Hole Oceanographic proved most productive, identifying an emergency equipment technician position with the geological survey team departing in 8 days. My background qualified me for the role, though the rushed security clearance would require explanation. Medical research requirement, I told the program coordinator. Time-sensitive project tracking circadian rhythm disruption during extended daylight periods. The fabrication worked. They emailed provisional acceptance within 2 hours, contingent upon medical clearance and background check completion. I forwarded my recent hospital records with annotations explaining the injuries as hiking accident results rather than predator wounds. Sarah didn't answer my calls. I left 3 messages requesting updates on her Australia arrangements and offering airport transportation. After the 4th attempt went to voicemail, I checked flight records through my university travel portal. No bookings under her name appeared for international departures in the coming week. I drove to her apartment at 7:35 in the evening. The sun had set 18 minutes earlier, casting Cambridge streets into shadow. I parked in the visitor section and approached her ground floor unit, noticing immediately that her door stood 3 inches ajar, splintered around the deadbolt. "Sarah?" I called from the threshold, listening for movement inside. The apartment remained silent. I pushed the door wider with my elbow, revealing deep gouges in the wooden frame. 4 parallel marks spaced approximately 2 inches apart, extending from doorknob height to floor. The pattern matched the creature's claws exactly. I entered cautiously, scanning for evidence. The living room remained orderly with books aligned on shelves and furniture undisturbed. Sarah's laptop sat closed on the coffee table beside a manila folder labeled Field Notes Siberia in her precise handwriting. I opened the folder and found site photographs, including 3 clear images of the monolith with carved symbols clearly visible. In the kitchen, a mug of tea had cooled on the counter, untouched. The bedroom showed signs of interrupted packing, suitcase open on the bed, partially filled with folded clothes. A small desk calendar displayed circled dates, April 7th through 10th marked in red with Melbourne written across them. The bathroom door hung open, light still burning. Inside, 3 droplets of blood marked the white tile floor beside the shower. More blood traced a path toward the unit's rear exit, not pooling or smearing, but distinct droplets, spaced approximately 18 inches apart, as if falling from a carried object rather than an injured person moving under their own power. The trail led to the building's basement access door, which showed the same 4-mark pattern gouged into metal. Beyond the door, concrete stairs descended into darkness. The blood droplets continued down the steps, visible under my flashlight beam until disappearing at a utility tunnel entrance. The tunnel's steel grate had been torn from its hinges, bent outward, as if struck by tremendous force. I didn't follow the trail further. Instead, I photographed everything with my phone, careful not to disturb potential evidence. The timestamps would establish a chronology for authorities, though I knew standard investigation protocols would reveal nothing useful. In Sarah's kitchen, I called the emergency number from my contacts. "Campus Police, what's your emergency?" "Possible break-in and abduction at 43 Wendell Street, apartment 1C, faculty housing, Dr. Sarah Johnson." I kept my voice clinical, detached. "Signs of forced entry and blood evidence. Victim missing. Officers are being dispatched. Please remain on site if safe to do so." I ended the call and returned to the living room, where Sarah's research folder remained open on the table. I removed the monolith photographs and slipped them into my jacket pocket before police arrived. The images wouldn't help their investigation, but might attract something else if left behind. The police took my statement with professional efficiency. I identified myself as Sarah's colleague, explained my welfare check after failed communication attempts, and described finding the damaged door. I omitted the blood trail beyond the basement door, knowing officers would discover it during their systematic search. The detective labeled the case a potential home invasion, promising to check security cameras and canvass his neighbors. "Any reason someone would target Dr. Johnson specifically?" she asked, notepad ready. "None that would make sense to you," I thought but didn't say. Instead, I mentioned valuable research equipment and recent international travel as potential motives. I left as forensic technicians arrived with evidence collection kits. Their methodical approach would document everything without providing answers. The entities didn't leave interpretable evidence beyond the obvious destruction necessary for access. At my apartment, I packed systematically. Cold weather gear, emergency supplies, medical kit, and essential documentation. The Antarctic assignment provided ideal cover for disappearance. Even if the entities could somehow track across continents as Anna claimed, they couldn't reach a location where their activation trigger, the crescent moon, never appeared. I booked the earliest available flight to Christchurch, New Zealand, the staging point for Antarctic program participants. The departure time read 5:45 the following morning, leaving 9 hours to finalize preparations and reach the airport. After securing my apartment, I drove to the university's Department of Astronomy building, using my faculty access card to enter after hours. The fourth-floor laboratory contained lunar tracking equipment more precise than commercial systems. I logged into the database and calculated exact positioning for the April 8th crescent, as it would appear over Sarah's apartment building. The resulting projection matched the coordinates from the Siberian site with 97% accuracy. Whatever triggered the entity's hunting phase would occur in precisely the same configuration over Cambridge in 18 days. I downloaded the data to a portable drive, then systematically erased access records from the system. Before leaving, I sent an encrypted message to Robert's personal email, not his university account, which he'd likely abandoned. April 8th, 11, crescent aligned. Confirm safe location without lunar visibility. Sarah compromised. Heading to position without moon. Destroy all site materials. Whether he would read it or heed the warning remained uncertain. I'd fulfilled my obligation as expedition leader regardless. At Logan International, I checked my single bag and proceeded through security 4 hours before scheduled departure. The terminal remained sparsely populated, most travelers still asleep in their homes. I found a seat facing the large windows overlooking the tarmac, positioning myself beneath a security camera for additional documentation. If the entities came for me before boarding, at least the recording might provide evidence for those who followed. I placed Anna's satellite phone and mineral pouch on the seat beside me, ready if needed. The terminal's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across empty gates, while runway lights blinked in patterns across the darkness outside. I reviewed the Siberian journal entries on my tablet, searching for patterns we'd missed. The entity's behavior followed consistent protocols: ceremonial gathering, coordinated hunting, specific targeting based on observation or blood contact. Sarah had documented the monolith carvings extensively, creating the strongest possible connection through study and reproduction of their symbols. I touched the photographs in my pocket, understanding why they had found her first. The images created a beacon, a connection stronger than mere observation. My own connection through blood contact would draw them next unless I reached a location beyond the crescent's influence. Boarding began at 5:15 in the morning. I took my assigned seat, stowed my carry-on, and watched as other passengers settled around me, unaware of what hunted in their city. The plane pushed back from the gate at 5:42, turned toward the runway, and accelerated into darkness. As we lifted off, I looked down at Boston's grid of lights spreading beneath us. Sarah was already gone. Robert might survive if he followed my warning. Others who handled our samples, examined our recordings, or processed James's remains would create their own connections to the entities, becoming potential targets during the approaching lunar phase. I hadn't escaped the Siberian village. I'd merely survived long enough to understand the nature of our discovery. The entities would track those they had marked across any distance, patient and methodical, waiting for the crescent moon to reach its position before completing their harvest. The satellite phone sat in my jacket pocket, Anna's number programmed and ready. I would call from Christchurch if my Antarctic passage faced delays. Her people had survived generations of the hunting cycle, developing methods to confuse or temporarily repel the entities. But as our plane climbed above cloud cover where moonlight illuminated the darkness, I understood the truth beneath her warnings. No one escaped permanently. The entities would track their marked prey across the globe, through each lunar cycle, until the crescent moon finally claimed its due.